YCS Indie is in the books, but the format as a whole is just beginning. And while I found the fact that over a dozen completely different themes and strategies were able to make the top cut, others seem to think that this is not only a frustrating thing, but also something that makes the format overall unenjoyable. I brought this up in my YCS recap video I uploaded on Monday, and side note, for anyone who hasn't watched that video, I implore you to check it out so that you can find out everything that happened at Indy. Back to the sentiment, which has brought up a bigger discussion I'd like to discuss in this video, and that's about format diversity and whether it actually makes them worse and can even outright ruin them. Let's give some quick context on where this entire discussion and topic really spawns from. YouTuber and top tier player Pac, whose real name is way too difficult for me to pronounce, but I'm sure most of you guys know who I'm talking about. Pac put out a video over a week ago titled "I Hate This Format," in which he gives his grievances and problems with the Yu-Gi-Oh metagame post Age of Overlord. Some of his issues were that every deck felt more or less terrible, all the meta decks had too many lose conditions, and, in my opinion, most importantly, that there were too many decks in the Yu-Gi-Oh metagame itself. During the YCS Indie tournament, where Pac opted to play purely, Pac doubled down on the overall sentiment of his earlier video, tweeting out, quote, "This is the worst format I've ever played." This led to other high-profile players and YCS champions like Jeff Jones to respond and overall agree with statements like, quote, "It's so crazy. The thing is, people won't understand why it's so awful." Pac didn't go into greater detail on Twitter, but again, the sentiment seems to be that formats that feature as many or more competitively viable decks as what we currently have in our metagame right now just aren't enjoyable, at least for high-level players. It's an interesting standpoint, and if you're a multi-time YCS winner like Pac or Jeff Jones, who enters any given YCS with legitimate aspirations of winning the entire event, and your overall satisfaction and experience can often closely be tied to that outcome, I can completely understand this. These are the type of players who test the top 5 decks of the meta and their various matchups for hours upon hours each day, and losing because you got randomly matched up against the 13th or 14th best deck of the format, to which you probably have no answers in your main and side and have barely tested against, is definitely wildly frustrating. However, as someone who isn't nearly on that quote-unquote pro player level, but still plays the game competitively and competes at regional qualifiers and maybe 3 to 4 YCS level events per year, I've seen and am well aware of the other side of the spectrum. You know, the formats where there's only 1 or maybe 2 competitively viable decks, i.e. tier 0. And how much of an absolute grueling nightmare those formats have been for about 90% of the player base. My take has always been that variety is the spice of life, and while in competitive games or sport we always want to see the best win, I think that most would agree that taking away options and variety just for the heck of it usually makes the overall experience far less interesting and just flat out boring. Take Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Smash, or Tekken, whatever your favorite fighting game is. Would these games be better or more fun if there were only 2 characters instead of 30? How about if every sports league went down to just 2 teams? Sure, in these instances, you'd always have the better team or player winning, but it'd also be boring as hell. Pro players tend to love these 1 to 2 deck formats and speak glowingly about them. It could be because they genuinely like the viable decks at the time. Or, on the other hand, it could also be that instead of having to worry about 10 decks, they know that it's much more likely they'll only need to know 2, and they can spend all their time just focusing on those specific matchups. It's generally believed that a majority of pro players tend to hate wide open formats like this, where basically 15 different decks can top a YCS, and in theory, they could play against any of them round to round. But here's the thing, even if we were in a much more confined format with far less options, wouldn't the same still be true on some level? Let's go back to YCS Las Vegas in February, where Kashtira was expected to be the best deck of the format, which ultimately it was. However, Branded and Labyrinth were expected to be the next best decks. For this event, this also turned out to be the case, with those decks being played by the runner-ups of the event. In essence, we had a big 3 at the beginning of that metagame, but that doesn't mean that a dozen of other tier 2 or rogue level decks still couldn't have been at the top tables or even made the top cut of that event. In fact, that's exactly what happened at YCS Vegas, with decks like Marincess, Live Twin Sprites, and Runic Stun all making the top cut. Furthermore, outside of straight up tier 0 formats like a Shizu Tier Element or Teledad, this actually happens in every format in Yu-Gi-Oh history. Even when you have a clear and defined tier 1 of a few decks that are objectively better than the ones below them, duelists will still play lower tier decks, whether it be for comfort reasons, meta calls, or maybe they just don't have access to the other cards, and they will still top with those lower tier decks. Look at YCS Dortmund and how the finals featured Rika against my beloved Vanquish Soul, two decks that weren't in anyone's top tier. YCS Philadelphia that happened in the spring saw Eldritch Stun and Dinomorphia of all things both making it to the top 16, when I don't think anyone even had them as like tier 2 decks. My point is, running into random jank decks that you aren't expecting is gonna happen in almost every metagame that you play. Yes, it makes it difficult to cover all matchups, as currently it's nearly impossible to find cards that are going to work well against Vanadium and also something like Runic Stun. I'm using these as examples because they both actually topped YCS Indianapolis, but I think that that's also part of the beauty of deck building. The fact sometimes you have to really dig into the weeds and search for these super obscure cards that might have overlap coverage for multiple matchups. If you're unwilling to do that, I also think that's fine, because sometimes it's not worth using lower quality cards to cover matchups that are super unlikely to face. These are just important decisions to make in the deck building process, and they have risk and rewards. I'm bringing this aspect up because personally, I think that this is a more interesting process than mindlessly citing 8 cards for the tier mirror match and 7 for Fluunderies like people were doing exactly a year ago at this point. To bring up something else Pac mentioned, all the meta decks that we have right now may seem a bit underpowered or have some major flaw, but I'd argue that that puts the onus on the player to get the most out of these decks, and that you still can make good meta calls. Pac chose purely for YCS Indy, and it didn't work out for him on that weekend. However, Pearly did make top 4 at the event, which proves emphatically, in my opinion, that it was fully capable of winning the event and that you can still make those YCS winning meta calls. I also think that Pac's point about making a meta call to like win a YCS, it's a legitimate point, but it's not really applicable for like 95% of people in the Yu-Gi-Oh community. Most players don't just go from, you know, decent or everyday Yu-Gi-Oh Joe to boom, I'm entering my first or second YCS and I'm in the finals, I'm taking home the trophy. Usually there's a maturation process. For the average player, I think a much more realistic goal is to make a meta call to like top a YCS, and I think that you have a better chance of doing that in a format where you have a lot of different meta decks, and you could hypothetically be playing anything, and it's very difficult for your opponent to play a bunch of cards to like, counter every strategy out there, as opposed to a format where maybe you only have 1 or 2 decks, and it's like, man, you better really be good at that matchup, otherwise you're not going to have a lot of success. If you look at YCS Indy, Johnny Wynn, aka Asian Persuasion, I think he did exactly this. He played Runic Stun, he ended up making top 32. If you watched a lot of the YCS, you saw a lot of low impact hand traps, cards like Effect Failure, Infinite Impermanence. We saw some of the other hand traps like Nibiru and Droll and Lockbird also be popular, and then we saw SP Little Knights and Forbidden Droplets also just kind of like everywhere, and those cards altogether aren't that good against Runic. We didn't see a lot of Cosmic Cyclone, and if Johnny predicted all of this, if this was what he was anticipating, then you could say that he made an amazing meta call and he was rewarded with a top cut spot. In the end, I completely understand where a player like Pac is coming from, but at the same time, I think that his perspective is honestly only applicable for like 5% of players who enter YCSs. Players who are completely content with playing mirror matches for like 10 rounds of Swiss. Me, on the other hand, I've got a different perspective. I mean, I would love to top a YCS, and I do obviously enter these events to win, but I would much rather watch paint dry than play against the same exact deck every single round after round after round. And when we are in these formats where you only have 1 or 2, maybe even 3 viable decks, it's just not that interesting. That's at the point where I kind of lose interest in playing the game competitively, because it's just mundane. It's boring just seeing the same exact plays, the same exact decks. I mean, I remember a little over a year ago when we were in Ishizu tier formats, and it's like, oh yeah, cool, we get to watch tier versus tier for the 6th round in a row, or we get to watch tier versus flu for the 4th time, during the YCS live stream. And it's like, we have nothing else to feature because that's all anyone is playing. But I want to pass the question on to you guys, the audience. How do you feel about this format, and how do you guys feel about there being an abundance of viable decks? Do you feel like too many decks is making this format bad? Do you think that that is inherently a bad thing about a format? Or do you like it? Do you like formats where you can play an abundance of decks? There's like 5, 10, even 15 different meta decks that you could play, and theoretically, or I guess even realistically, because it basically just happened, top a YCS with. Anyways, whatever you guys think, leave it in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching as always.